Before we go into some vital information, we're going to hit up the basics to make sure we're all on the same page. So let's go to our sprites folder, and I'm going to drag in this background sprite here. I like to drag it into the hierarchy, but you can also drag it into your scene view. But if we drag it into the sample scene, the hierarchy area, it actually kind of snaps it to the origin of the world. Now, it automatically creates and sets this up as a game object, specifically a sprite game object, because we have the sprite renderer component. That's what makes this a sprite game object. And every game object is going to have a transform component, right? So we have our X, we have our Y up and down, and then we have our Z, which you're not going to see what that does right away in a 2D game. If we click this 2D button in our viewport here, and we kind of look at this, you can see if we drag this forward, we can move it around. And the one difference it'll make is, let's drag our game view over so you can see this. But if I drag this too much in front of the camera, it no longer renders the sprite, because if we look at our camera is facing that direction. Now our camera default is normally in the Z -10, where our props background is going to be normally 0. Now I need to reset this, so I'm going to go up to the 3 dots, the vertical ellipse, or the transform menu, depending on what you want to call it. But you need to know vertical ellipse and that it's also the menu for the transform. And then we can go to reset property and position. There you go. Now it's back at the origin at 0, 0, 0. You'll notice the scale, the default is 1, 1, 1. That's the default value for how we imported the sprite. Whatever size it is, the scale value default will be 1, 1, 1. So we'll drag in these other sprites in a little bit that will create a game object for each kind of sprite for our game, whether it be the player, a coin, or a wall or platform. The sprite renderer is a component, which is a specific behavior for this game object. Versus if we do add component, we can add additional behaviors. So for instance, there are a box collider, which we wouldn't want right now. There's an audio source if we wanted to add some audio. So different behaviors, we have some shortcuts by adding other components to control those behaviors. So what we did was a shortcut from Unity, dragging in the sprite, which creates a game object with the sprite renderer, which allows us to render the sprite here on the camera in our view to be able to see that. We can also right click in our hierarchy and go to 2D sprites. And depending on which version of Unity, you may have some template sprites here. So in this version, I have square, circle, and capsule that I could do as well. And 9 slice, where we can actually slice up and reuse parts of a sprite. That's really useful later on. Now I'm just going to do like a square for right now. So you notice as soon as we do square, it names it square. And it's using this default sprite called square, this white square. And so we can be able to use that to say white box out our level. Now you notice in my scene view, as soon as I move this, there's like this kind of weird glitch where it kind of disappears. And what's happening is with 2D games, we're really not using the Z axis, because even if I change that, right, look at that, it's still like kind of glitchy. And the reason is the camera is not using the Z depth for these different images. It's actually using what we call the sorting layers. So for 2D sprites, we're going to use these sorting layers to organize our sprites and have them render. We can easily swap out sprites really quickly though. Instead of having this square, we can go ahead and just swap out the sprite. And the way we do that is this sprite comes from the Unity engine square. But I can just grab my ball sprite and I'm going to drag it into this slot here. Boop. And there we go. Now we can see it, but we can't see it. So if I move it over here, look at now. Now in our game view, I should be seeing it right here, and it's not there. So let's go ahead and set up our sorting layers, and we may change this later. Now, before we can assign a sorting layer, we have to create them. So I can do add sorting layers. So currently, the default sorting layer is default. Now, the way layers work is this is which is rendered first, and then so on and so forth. So when it renders first, that's going to actually be in the background. Whatever it renders second will then be on top of that. Think of if you were making a cake with different layers, and you've got the first bottom part of the cake is chocolate. You put it on first, right? And then we do the middle is like a strawberry cake. Okay, well then that's the second one. It's on top, right? So that's what's kind of going on here. So what we're going to do is create another layer, and maybe we'll call this one background. And we can then do maybe one for the player layer, and then one for foreground, or we could say front ground. We may also have a back and front. So maybe I'll call this foreground. So stuff that I want to be rendered on top of the player. And then we could have a front, which would be the closest to the camera. So now that we've got our sorting layers set up, we're going to select our square again. And I think I'm going to call this now, we'll call it ball. And then we'll go to our sorting layer. It's still set to default. And we'll change that from default. We'll just put this on the player layer. Now you notice in our game view, it's in front. And so I'm going to Alt and left drag to maneuver or orbit around my 3D view. You don't necessarily have to do this. I'm just showing something. And I can move this in the Z depth, and you can see it doesn't matter where it's at because it's all about how the computer is rendering. It's rendering the background, and then it's rendering the ball on top of that. So we can just bring this forward or just put it at 0. That's totally fine. So I'm just going to switch this back to 2D view. So that's going to be what's pretty common here. So we have that nicely set up. An important note is the sorting layers also have order in layer, because we may have lots of things on the player layer. So maybe we'll put our coins and other interactable objects that maybe we want to be right here around where the player is playing. They're not necessarily in the background. So in that case, we could identify numbers to put them in front. So the higher the number, so 0 would be right now kind of in the back, and 1 would be on top of that, 2 on top of that, so on and so forth. In our scene view, we can't see everything in our scene. And one of the shortcuts to kind of maximize our background is we're first going to select our props background game object. And then we're going to hover our mouse in the scene view and press F. I like to think F stands for frame it. So we're framing it, whatever we have selected. The other shortcut, with not pressing F, is you can also double click. So I can double click the background, or I can double click our square, which never renamed because I didn't click enter. So I can type in ball again and then press enter. You can also go to the edit menu and do frame selected. Now our project, we can see if I frame this or press F, you can see we have these grid lines, which helps with providing spacing, and we can also use that for snapping. So if we go up to our kind of toolbar here in our scene view, we get a wide variety of tools, and this can change every version depending on what updates or how they may reorganize or create new icons for. The grid settings used to be in just one menu. Now they've split them out. So we have one is just for the grid visible options. So we can actually put the grid on the X or the Y or the Z. The default is going to be the Y. And our opacity, we can drag to make this visible or not. So we're going to make this 0% for right now, and then we'll come back and change that. Our next menu is going to be for grid snapping. And you get, all of these have kind of two things. You have one, the icon, where you can click that on and off. And then you have the down arrow, which lets you know there are more options that you could also choose. So this one specifically says that your tool handle rotation has to be set to global. So there are two settings here. We have the tool handle position and tool handle rotation. So the tool handle rotation here is global rotation, so we can change that, and it says to set it to global. So we'll keep that at global. And the reason it's not turning on, even though we're in global, is because I'm in the rect transform tool, which is really useful for UI. But you can see for the snapping, it's not letting us get that option. So if I switch to the move tool, it's now set with global, but now it comes on. So this allows us where we can snap this, say background. If we grab here, it'll actually snap the pivot point to the grid squares. Now we can click the down arrow and see we get the grid size is 1 by 1 by 1, so you get these 1 by 1 squares. And Unity uses the unit meters in here. That is their unit of measurement. So we can even use an align selected, so we can align things, which is really nice. And then we can come over here to increment snapping. So when we're moving an object, if we want to do increments of 25, we can do that. Rotation is having an increment. You're rotating an object by 15 degrees, and scale is just by 1. So it'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's just regular scale. So we have that. So I can turn off this snapping off by clicking the icon on and off. I'm going to set my opacity back down to 0. I'm going to zoom in slightly and select our ball. Now we can grab our scale tool and we can grab a specific axis and it will scale this. Now of course it's going to stretch or squash our sprite, which doesn't look good. The other way is over in our transform component. We can put our mouse on, let's say, the Y letter and drag as well. So a negative number will flip the sprite. The other way is we can actually type in a number. So if we wanted to scale it at 2, and on the X, 2, now we've scaled our object by typing in numbers. Now, if we have linking off, if we have that on and I type in 3, it will automatically make that a 3 by 3 or a 2 by 2, 1 by 1. So it's going to keep those at that specific, they're linked together. You can note that changing the value for the Z scale on the Z axis is going to have no effect for these 2D games. You can think of each sprite as kind of like a panel of glass where we've painted on the image. So our sprites are not going to have any depth or volume. Now, if you'll notice our game area or our zone that we have currently, it adjusts based on our windows. You can see this, and we can't see all of the graphics here. So we're going to make some adjustments so that we can see everything. So we're going to select our main camera, and you can see here we have a transform and an audio listener, and who knows what else they may add as a default later on, but that's what Unity has right now. And then we have the camera component, which is what actually controls this game object. It gives it the behavior for a camera, essentially making it a camera for us. Because we set up this project as a 2D project, the camera is automatically set to orthographic. That's the default. So any cameras or extra cameras that we create will be orthographic. That is, they will not have any perspective as getting that angle bigger or smaller as getting further away, like the way our eyes view things. To temporarily get a closer look to kind of see the projection for the camera, we can switch from 2D to 3D mode, and we can see the camera. The viewable area here is called the frustum. And that's what we're seeing with these lines and what the camera is seeing. So if we change our projection method from orthographic to perspective, you'll see the frustum changes, because now we're going to have this perspective type camera that has a different look, the way it views everything. To show another difference visually, if we grab our ball sprite, and you can use the move tool or press W, if I bring it forward in the Z axis, you'll see it actually gets bigger in the game view for what the camera is seeing. Versus if I bring it back, it gets smaller and smaller. So I'm going to put the Z back to 0, select my camera, and change it back to orthographic. So now orthographic, no matter what in the Z, if I move it forward or backward, it's still going to be the same size because there's no perspective. Obviously, it's an orthographic camera. But kind of explaining those two terms hopefully helps a lot. Now, to actually visualize this accurately, because right now our camera changes based on our kind of viewports, windows here, we're going to go to our game view and change it from free aspect, which is going to change because it's just free. We're going to change it to 16:9, which is the aspect ratio of a widescreen monitor. So that's going to more look like and take on the properties for that. So now we get a camera preview here, and we can see it adjusted where we can see that. Now our camera size is going to control the zooming in and out, essentially, of what the camera is seeing. So if we adjust this out to say 8, you can see we get this blue background. So on our camera, behavior is actually putting that color in the background. This is where you can actually change that, and you could have a different color as your background. Now I just randomly chose a color. If you click on this, I could pick one of the default grays, like 32 by 32, and you'll see we have two other additional things here. We have the alpha, which is actually going to control the transparency if we had something that was behind the background. But for any of the sprites, you're going to have this same value setting that you could on sprites make transparent. And we have this decimal code, this color code essentially, for the color. So this particular gray's hexadecimal code is 202020. I'm going to go back to my sprites folder now that we have our background and we have our ball in here. I'm going to also drag in this beam, and I'm going to drag it into the hierarchy, and it will automatically be at the default, the origin of the world. And here, I'll go back to my 2D view, and I can just grab either the move tool or the rect tool or even the transform tool. But here, if I grab the axis itself, the green, it's only going to allow it to move down. So no matter how I move my mouse left and right, it only goes down. There is a kind of blue square in the middle, which signifies that I could use the Y and the X axis, and I can move it that way. So in this case, I'm going to maybe put this right on top of our other sprite here, so that our beam kind of sits nicely and stands out and pops. Now, anytime you drag in your sprites, you then want to set up which sorting layer are they on, and if you have a specific order in the layer. So the ball is on the player layer. I could put the beam on the player layer. And one of the things is, if I have this bounce, do I want it to, maybe the white edge to be on top of the beam, or maybe go behind the beam? And since the beam is also order in layer 0, the ball I could put -1, and you can see that it goes behind. May not be something we want in this case, but it is something we can definitely do as well. I may just leave that at 0, maybe even put that at 1, so it does kind of stay on top of our beam. And one of my #1 tips is, as you're going along, always save your scene and your project. You'll see here with this asterisk again reminding us that we haven't saved recently and we don't want to lose any of our work. So I'm going to go ahead and do Control S on Windows, or if you're on a Mac, Command S to save your scene.